Hello everyone, and welcome to the Complex Cinema channel. We're so glad to have you here today. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting that like button to show your support. Today, we are going to be discussing the film My Bodyguard is the Death Lord, which is coming out in 2026. The flickering neon of Neo Kyoto casts long, rain-slicked shadows as our narrative begins, focusing immediately on Kalen, a man whose reputation precedes him like a chilling draft. Kalen, you see, is no mere enforcer. He is an artisan of finality, often whispered about in the shadowy circles where deals are sealed with lead and silence. His past is deeply etched, marked by a stint in the highly secretive, almost mythical Hades unit of the old corporate wars, an experience that honed his lethal efficiency but carved deep canyons into his soul. He moves with the weary grace of a fallen samurai, a stark contrast to the city's frantic energy. His world collides, or rather locks down, with that of Ilara Vance. Ilara, conversely, is a creature of pure, vibrant light in a world of manufactured darkness. A prodigy in bio-cybernetic integration, she was the darling of Omnicorp's R&D division, celebrated for designs that bordered on miraculous, though perhaps a touch too ambitious for corporate comfort. Her career trajectory, initially skyrocketing like a perfectly calibrated drone, hit a sudden, devastating snag when her latest project, a revolutionary neural interface, was deemed too volatile, too much in the hands of the creator. The central tension ignites when Ilara realizes she is marked, not by common thugs, but by the very conglomerate that once showered her with accolades. She seeks the best, the one name even Omnicorp hesitates to whisper in their secure communication channels. Kalen. When they first meet in a derelict Skydock cafe, the air crackles with mutual suspicion. Kalen is unimpressed by her pedigree. He judges by immediate threat assessment, and Ilara, despite her terrified bearing, registers as an enormous liability. Kalen accepts the contract, perhaps more intrigued by the sheer audacity of Omnicorp trying to reclaim their asset than by the exorbitant fee. His method of protection is less about defensive maneuvers and more about preemptive strikes, a philosophy honed during his time deep within the infrastructure of the war machine, where standing still was synonymous with being erased. He begins subtly dismantling the periphery threats, a meticulously placed electrical surge here, a perfectly timed traffic accident there, all while keeping Ilara tethered to his grim reality. Ilara, forced to abandon her antiseptic laboratories, finds herself grappling with Kalen's brutal pragmatism. She sees the ghost in his eyes, the perpetual vigilance that denies sleep. Her own background, filled with the sterile logic of algorithms and the promise of human enhancement, offers little comfort against the visceral threat they face. Yet, she possesses knowledge, the schematics of the very interface Omnicorp desperately wants, which makes her a living target. The middle act escalates into a desperate flight through the underlevels of Neo Kyoto, a labyrinth of forgotten tech and desperate inhabitants. Kalen uses his intimate knowledge of the city's forgotten circulatory system, drawing on skills that predate his mercenary career, perhaps remnants from a youth spent navigating urban sprawl too complex for law enforcement. During a harrowing confrontation in a collapsing maglev tunnel, where they are cornered by corporate retrieval specialists armed with sonic disruptors, technology Ilara herself might have conceptually inspired, Kalen moves with startling, almost inhuman precision. He shields her, taking heavy fire, an act of protection that feels less like a hired duty and more like a deeply buried sense of responsibility asserting itself. This incident forces a fragile trust. Ilara starts to see the man beneath the myth, recognizing that his cold exterior shields a deeply fractured sense of honor, a commitment to finishing what he starts. She begins applying her own skills, not to fight, but to enable Kaylin's survival. She subtly hacks security feeds, redirects automated defenses, turning the city's smart infrastructure against its masters. The climax unfolds at the Omnicorp Central Data Spire, a monument to unchecked technological ambition. Kaylin's final approach is a masterclass in infiltration, utilizing smoke, misdirection, and his profound understanding of kinetic vulnerabilities. Ilara's role is crucial. She must upload a counter-protocol into the core system to wipe the proprietary data, effectively rendering the dangerous interface inert and destroying the leverage Omnicorp holds over her. In the final confrontation against the lead retrieval operative, a figure mirroring Kaylin's own past efficiency, perhaps a product of a newer generation of corporate assassins. The fight is brutal and deeply personal. Kaylin doesn't just win, he dismantles the threat systematically, showing no hesitation, no mercy. When the dust settles, and Ilara has successfully purged the system, the city's electronic heartbeat skips a beat in acknowledgement of the disruption. The aftermath is muted. Kaylin, wounded but whole, ensures Ilara is safely beyond the reach of immediate retaliation, perhaps arranging passage out of the sector entirely. There is no grand embrace, no declaration of partnership. He simply steps back into the shadows, the contract fulfilled, disappearing into the pervasive gloom of Neo-Kyoto, leaving Ilara Vance to confront a future she has irrevocably altered, both by her genius and by the terrifying loyalty of her silent guardian. Kaylin remains the necessary shadow, the Death Lord who, for a brief, violent moment, chose to guard the light. Kaylin's silhouette, even when standing perfectly still against the deluge outside the reinforced plasteel window of their temporary safe house, a forgotten maintenance hub overlooking the toxic river, always seemed to possess an inherent kinetic potential, the coiled spring before release. His movements, when observed closely by Ilara, were economical to the point of poetry. Every shift of weight conserved energy, a habit ingrained during years where energy expenditure meant the difference between surviving a skirmish and becoming background noise in the city's constant, low-frequency hum. His eyes, a pale, almost colorless gray, rarely focused on Ilara unless she was speaking or a clear threat materialized. Mostly they scanned peripheries, cataloging sightlines, ventilation shafts, and potential exit vectors, reflecting the constant, exhausting vigilance born from the Hades unit's ruthless training doctrine, which prioritized situational awareness above all else. The men he dispatched weren't merely enemies. They were variables he had eliminated from the equation of their continued existence. Ilara, meanwhile, found her own hands beginning to shake less when handling tools, though now the tools were salvaged, comm scramblers, and jury-rigged electronic locks rather than pristine surgical robotics. Her initial terror had curdled into a hard, sharp focus. She remembered the pride radiating from her mentors when she first achieved self-aware feedback loops in her neural designs, a pride that curdled into paranoia when Omnicorp realized the interface she built, codenamed Prometheus, could theoretically rewrite fundamental aspects of consciousness, giving the user not just control over machines, but potential dominion over networked minds. This ambition, the very thing that fueled her early career, was now the brand marking her for termination. She began observing Kaylin with a scientific curiosity, mapping his behavioral patterns as if he were a complex organic machine. She noted the slight tremor in his left hand only when he was completely still for too long, a phantom ache perhaps from an old wound sustained during that ill-fated raid on the old orbital defense grid, a story whispered only in the deepest tiers of underworld lore. Their communication evolved into a stark, functional shorthand. Ilara would state a technical limitation. Kalen would respond with a geographical solution. The perimeter sensors are active. Kalen, polishing the barrel of a high-caliber kinetic rifle that looked criminally out of place in this era of energy weapons, would simply reply, "We go under." He didn't ask how she could disable the sensors. He implicitly trusted that if she was marked, she was also capable. This unspoken faith was perhaps the most dangerous thing he offered her, demanding a performance she wasn't sure she could sustain. During a necessary stop in the forgotten archives beneath the old municipal library, a place Kalen navigated using obsolete subterranean maps he carried on treated parchment, Alara discovered something about his history that clicked into place. She recognized the architecture of the defunct network hubs they were bypassing. They matched diagrams she'd studied in early cyber warfare theory, systems designed to be abandoned if compromised. Kalen hadn't just been in a special unit. He had been one of the architects of the very infrastructure Omnicorp now relied upon, a secret knowledge that lent his current actions a veneer of professional resentment mixed with grim duty. He wasn't just running from the corporation. He was actively undermining the foundations he helped lay. The pervasive scent of ozone and recycled air in the lower sectors clung to them both. But where it seemed to revitalize Kalen's predatory instincts, it made Alara feel increasingly like a highly advanced piece of machinery running on low power. Yet, when Kalen was severely injured defending their route through the contaminated manufacturing zones, a close call involving automated demolition drones, Alara proved her worth beyond hacking. Working with salvaged medical polymers and makeshift sterilization units, she performed field surgery, her hands moving with the same precise, confident rhythm she used to calibrate processors, stabilizing him with a near-miraculous efficiency that shocked even Kalen. Seeing the raw dedication in her face as she fought to keep him breathing, he understood that Alara Vance was not just a flawed genius. She was a creator who understood the intrinsic value of complex systems, including him. In that moment, the transaction shifted from mercenary obligation to a shared investment in mutual survival against a world intent on consuming both their unique abilities. The quiet, shared vulnerability in that makeshift medical bay forged an almost imperceptible shift in their dynamic, moving beyond mere protection toward a symbiotic necessity. Kalen, recovering slowly, watched Alara not with the detached assessment of a bodyguard, but with the grudging respect of one expert observing another operating at peak capacity under duress. He began to volunteer information, carefully, testing the waters of her allegiance. He spoke of the Hades unit not as a glorious military past, but as a crucible that burned away everything unnecessary, leaving only reaction and survival imprinted on the psyche. He revealed that his extreme aversion to networked AI stemmed from witnessing firsthand how easily programmable loyalty could be flipped, a stark contrast to Alara, who sought to integrate humanity with the machine, not dominate it. This mutual recognition of the dangers inherent in ultimate control formed the bedrock of their alliance. Their path inevitably led them toward the fringes of the city's controlled zones, seeking out Silas Rook, a former Omnicorp systems analyst known for his profound, almost mystical talent for data corruption, a ghost in the machine who specialized in making evidence vanish entirely. Rook, a man whose entire physical existence seemed secondary to the data streams constantly flowing across his ocular implants, operated out of a repurposed orbital communications relay station, its shielding thankfully dampening most corporate surveillance sweeps. Kalen's approach to Rook was abrasive. He demanded access, citing old wartime debts, and leveraging veiled threats concerning Rook's own poorly laundered financial history. Rook, whose own career had ended when he exposed minor ethical breaches only to find himself professionally erased, responded with cynical caution, recognizing in Kalen the sharp edge of someone who had nothing left to lose, the most unpredictable element in any equation. Alara's contribution here was crucial. She didn't appeal to Rook's morality. She appealed to his craft. She demonstrated the sophistication of the Prometheus interface's core algorithms, the elegance of the code Omnicorp sought to control, and Rook was mesmerized. He saw not just a security risk, but a masterpiece of engineering. This appreciation unlocked his cooperation. Rook agreed to engineer a massive, multi-vector electronic smokescreen designed to blind Omnicorp's tracking systems for a critical 48-hour window, allowing them the necessary time for their final objective. While Rook worked the electronic loom, Kalen and Alara faced the immediate danger of corporate counterintelligence closing in. They were forced to endure a claustrophobic siege within the relay station, defending against increasingly desperate automated drones deployed by Omnicorp's security chief, Marcus Vane, a man whose ambition Kalen recognized as fatally similar to his own younger self, only channeled entirely toward corporate profit. Kalen fought with renewed ferocity, driven by the knowledge that if they failed here, Alara's innovative spirit would be crushed and weaponized, a fate worse than simple death in his view. The final 48 hours were a blur of accelerated paranoia and grinding exhaustion. Within the cramped confines of Rook's relay station, the air was thick with the smell of overheated circuitry and cheap synth stimulants. Kalen moved through the space like a predator assessing a cage, his senses perpetually extended. He'd taken to sleeping in short, violent bursts, always positioned with his back to the reinforced bulkhead, emerging from these brief periods of unconsciousness with the same grim alertness. Alara observed this ritualistic vigilance, understanding that for him, true rest was a luxury only the dead could afford. She noted a softening, almost a human warmth, that surfaced only when she managed to momentarily soothe the high-pitched whine of Rook's overloaded processors, or when she shared a meager ration bar with him, an offering he accepted, not with thanks, but with a brief, almost imperceptible nod that acknowledged the shared burden. Rook himself was a spectacle of controlled chaos, hunched over holographic interfaces, his fingers dancing across invisible keys, manifesting intricate layers of digital camouflage. He spoke in jargon laced with archaic computer folklore, referencing defunct protocols as if they were old friends. "We're not just hiding them, Death Lord," Rook muttered during one intense session, his eyes glowing faintly from the screen glare. "We're making Omnicorp chase echoes of echoes. Vane is running diagnostics on phantom firewalls right now." Rook clearly respected Kalen's reputation for absolute execution, seeing in the bodyguard a mirror of his own ruthless dedication to his craft, albeit one built on kinetic application rather than digital obfuscation. The tension peaked when Vane's human retrieval teams, finally circumventing Rook's initial digital traps, initiated a direct physical assault on the relay station's lower maintenance levels. Kalen didn't wait for a full breach. Relying on pre-programmed seismic sensors, Alara helped him adapt. He led the defense in the station's narrow access shafts. This engagement was brutally intimate. He utilized improvised weaponry, stripped conduit pipes, superheated steam vents, blending close-quarters combat with environmental manipulation. He moved too fast for the corporation's reinforced armor to compensate, relying on intuition honed in environments far less structured than this dying industrial relic. He wasn't fighting soldiers. He was erasing obstacles, displaying a grim economy of motion that spoke volumes about the psychological toll of his past. During a momentary lull after Kalen disabled the lead assault team with a skillfully detonated maintenance charge, Alara found the strength to confront Vane's plan head-on through a back channel Rook had compromised. She realized the true horror. Omnicorp didn't just want the Prometheus data. They intended to use the core interface, once stabilized by their own proprietary inhibitors, to launch a global network lockdown, effectively privatizing all information flow, including public safety and medical records. Her creation was meant to be the master key to global informational sovereignty. This revelation galvanized her purpose, stripping away the last vestiges of her former corporate loyalty. She was no longer protecting herself. She was protecting the very concept of open thought. When the 48 hours elapsed and the digital fog was at its thickest, they executed the final phase. Rook uploaded a highly specialized, destructive data packet designed not to steal, but to utterly atomize the Prometheus research within Omnicorp's central servers, a digital self-destruct that would also erase Ilara's direct involvement, leaving only the lingering, confusing ghost of a massive system failure. Kalen provided the final, necessary distraction, a targeted, violent engagement on the corporate grounds adjacent to the data spire, drawing Vane and his remaining forces away from the true attack vector. It was a performance of maximum noise, designed for minimum exposure, concluding with Kalen's silent, brutal confrontation with Vane, a swift, definitive end to the man who represented everything Kalen himself had narrowly escaped becoming. A perfectly optimized, soulless corporate tool. The bodyguard retreated then, not waiting for Ilara's final success confirmation, knowing that the absence of pursuit was the only confirmation he required, disappearing into the synthetic twilight as efficiently as he had always moved, his debt to the light momentarily settled. The dispersal of the data, the catastrophic digital implosion within Omnicorp's servers, resonated not as a triumphant explosion in Neo-Kyoto, but as a sudden, profound silence in the hyper-connected matrix that bound the city. For Ilara, standing in the relative safety of the abandoned transit hub Rook had designated as their final extraction point, the silence was deafening. It was the sound of her chains being shattered, a sensation alien and terrifyingly liberating. She felt the physical recoil of severing her life's work from the corporate monster, a psychic exhaustion settling deep in her bones, a stark contrast to the adrenaline that had fueled her for weeks. She knew Kalen had already executed his withdrawal. The lingering electronic surveillance had focused entirely on the chaos at the main spire, exactly as planned. Her focus shifted to the logistics of vanishing. Rook, having performed his digital exorcism, vanished immediately afterward, his only farewell a brief, encrypted message to Ilara. The best way to disappear is to never have been visible. Good luck, Creator. Ilara, packing only a specialized, miniaturized processing unit containing the seeds of her next concept, one far more decentralized and resilient, sought out the final rendezvous point Kalen had mapped out. An old geothermal exhaust vent leading to the outer periphery, a zone too polluted and unprofitable for Omnicorp to maintain continuous monitoring. When Kalen finally materialized, it was not from the main entry, but seemingly coalesced from the oily steam rising from the vent itself. He was more battered than she had ever seen him. The fight with Vane had left a deep, cauterized wound across his flank, evidence of a plasma weapon that had scraped against his specialized undersuit. Yet he moved with the same lethal grace, the weariness in his eyes momentarily eclipsed by a fierce, protective clarity. He didn't speak of Vane, but the finality of the silence confirmed the operative's removal. For Kalen, the resolution of a contract was always a purification, a temporary nullification of the threats that clung to him. He looked at Ilara, his pale gaze lingering, not searching for threats, but assessing her state of being. He saw the exhaustion, but also the steel beneath it, the realization that she had navigated a world of assassins and corporate espionage using only her mind. "The egress point is clear for 3 hours," he stated, his voice rougher than usual, perhaps strained by injury or the lack of necessary silence. After that, the sweep tightens. Ilara hesitated, the moment suspended between the brutal past they shared and the uncertain future. She reached into the pocket of her utility jacket and produced a small, archaic data chip, a physical object Kalen wouldn't ignore, containing a fully encrypted map of the former Hades unit's primary safe houses, information she'd gleaned from Rook's deep archival probes. "This is your exit," she said quietly. "A decade of untouchable safe zones. Use them, Kalen. Don't just disappear into the next shadow." He took the chip, his fingers brushing hers, a physical contact devoid of intimacy, yet thick with shared peril. He examined the data slate not as a gift, but as a tactical asset, understanding that she was offering him not charity, but leverage for his own continued existence. For the first time, Kalen offered something akin to acknowledgement of their bond. "You have survived," he noted, a statement heavy with implication, suggesting that survival in their world was the highest form of victory. He turned then, melting back toward the noxious steam, his repaired suit absorbing the weak perimeter light, making him indistinct from the shadows he inhabited. He did not look back. Ilara watched until the last trace of his presence, a momentary displacement of the condensing vapor, vanished. She understood then that Kalen was not a man designed for gratitude or companionship. He was a mechanism calibrated for termination, and in protecting her, he had briefly recalibrated himself toward preservation. As Ilara stepped into the pre-dawn gloom of the outer sectors, ready to build a future where genius was free, she carried the indelible imprint of the Death Lord, the terrifying reminder that sometimes the most profound loyalty is found in the person hired solely to ensure the final curtain falls on everyone else. Ilara moved into the unregulated zones, the air immediately heavier, less filtered, smelling of scorched metal and uncontrolled geothermal vents. This was the periphery, a patchwork of decentralized communities and forgotten infrastructure, where Omnicorp's pervasive influence thinned to mere suggestion. She shed her high-tech urban gear for utilitarian, durable clothing salvaged from a junk broker who asked no questions and accepted payment in untraceable crypto credits. The transition was an exercise in deliberate regression, a conscious choice to become technologically invisible, a strategy the Death Lord himself had perfected. She felt stripped down, vulnerable, but also frighteningly free from the constant digital tether that had defined her life within Omnicorp's gleaming towers. Her focus narrowed, to build something truly resilient, something that could exist outside the reach of centralized control, a digital wilderness immune to corporate fencing. Weeks bled into months. Ilara established a small, isolated workshop within the shell of an abandoned atmospheric regulator station. Her only companions were the rhythmic hiss of her cooling systems and the distant, muffled thrum of the city she had helped cripple. She worked tirelessly, driven by the need to outpace the inevitable corporate recovery efforts, knowing that Omnicorp, humiliated by the Prometheus disaster, would dedicate immense resources to finding the rogue asset. Her new designs were based on distributed ledger technology woven into biological substrates, systems that physically resisted remote overrides. She recalled Kalen's almost contemptuous dismissal of networked loyalty. Her solution was to create intelligence that had no single point of centralized failure, digital Darwinism applied to code. Meanwhile, Kalen was utilizing the Hades unit schematics Ilara provided with chilling efficiency. He moved like a ripple in the urban subconscious, striking only at the edges of Omnicorp's secondary operations, intercepting data couriers, disrupting small-scale acquisitions teams sent to hunt down loose ends. He wasn't hunting Vane's replacements directly. He was pruning the branches that might eventually lead back to Ilara. His actions were defensive, surgical, and profoundly patient. He understood that the greatest mistake an apex predator could make was to advertise its continued existence. He used the old safe houses only for resupply and minimal rest, treating them as temporary anchors in a fluid existence. The map Ilara gave him represented not sanctuary, but a collection of tactical advantages, a way to keep his pursuers permanently off balance, forcing them to expend resources chasing ghosts in outdated infrastructure. One rainy cycle, Kalen found a subtle anomaly in his otherwise clean data stream. A micropacket hidden deep within the noise profile of a low-orbit weather satellite transmission. It wasn't a direct message, but a single complex mathematical constant, one Ilara had used during her doctoral defense, a unique digital signature she would never share unless she felt an existential need. It signaled that she was stable, but perhaps also that her progress had stalled, or that she sensed an immediate, unforeseen danger. Kalen didn't deviate from his patrol pattern, but his internal calculations accelerated. He recognized that her current state of low visibility was a necessary camouflage, but one that also made her acutely vulnerable to surprise attack. She was too far outside the established network to call for his immediate intervention. He decided on a calculated risk, a breach of their established protocol of non-contact. He initiated a sequence Rook had taught him, a brief, untraceable burst of energy mimicking a minor grid fluctuation in Ilara's sector. It was a flare, a signal only she would recognize as a deliberate, targeted communication designed to prompt a minimal response. Kalen settled into an overwatch position on a crumbling industrial spire miles from Ilara's last known sector, the wind tearing at his worn trench coat. He waited, not with the anxious tension of a lover or friend, but with the focused, unyielding readiness of a weapons system awaiting the command to engage. He knew, with the certainty of long-honed instinct, that if this flare drew a corporate response, he would be there to intercept it, ready to resume his role as the Death Lord, guarding the fragile, burgeoning light of the new future Ilara was painstakingly building from the wreckage. The response from Ilara was subtle, almost missed by less attuned senses. Instead of a digital signal, Kalen detected a minute shift in the local power grid's harmonic resonance near the abandoned regulator station. It wasn't a distress call, but a calculated alteration in the energy output of her workshop, a deliberate tuning of the magnetic field around her core processing unit, a trick she must have devised to test the stability of her bio-substrate creations. It was a statement of controlled progress, a digital wave against the shore of silence. Kalen allowed himself a fraction of a second to process the information. She was thriving, but perhaps too complacent in her isolation. The external world did not respect boundaries, especially boundaries built on fragile, untraceable code. He knew Omnicorp would eventually tire of chasing phantom data and return to the source, the creator herself. His presence needed to become a known deterrent, a visible consequence for any agent who dared to approach her perimeter. He left the high spire, descending into the lower, perpetually shadowed commercial districts, where obsolete maintenance bots still shuffled along routine tracks. Here, Kalen began his campaign of calculated deterrence. He didn't eliminate corporate scouts directly. Instead, he orchestrated near misses. A transport carrying Omnicorp's senior security analysts suddenly found its navigation system overridden, sending the vehicle into a 5-hour chaotic loop through the toxic marshlands. Another team, attempting to place covert listening devices near known geothermal vents, found their highly specialized sensors fused by a precise, localized electromagnetic pulse, a signature mirroring the precise power surge needed to stabilize Ilara's biocircuitry. These were not random acts of sabotage. They were precisely calibrated warnings delivered through proxies, demonstrating an intimate understanding of Omnicorp's internal security methodologies, knowledge only someone with Kalen's background or someone working intimately with Ilara's recent output could possess. Ilara, sensing the sudden, localized disruption, the precise, almost artistic interference in the static she had grown accustomed to, felt a familiar tightening in her chest, a mix of dread and profound reassurance. She knew Kalen was close. His signature was unmistakable. He didn't just fight the enemy. He dismantled the system that allowed the enemy to function in that specific area. She retreated further into the heart of her regulator station, overlaying a new layer of defensive algorithms she called the Ghost Fence, code designed to lure intruders into complex, cyclical feedback loops, essentially trapping them in digital purgatory until they starved of processing power. This wasn't an act of aggression, but of necessary self-defense, inspired by the ruthless logic Kalen had demonstrated. Their relationship solidified into a non-verbal pact of mutual expertise. Kalen managed the physical reality, the drones, the agents, the tangible threats, while Ilara managed the informational reality, ensuring that every countermeasure Kalen faced was met with an equally sophisticated digital defense. He was the shield honed by war. She was the fortress, constantly reinventing its own walls. As Kalen neutralized the last visible scouting element near the periphery, ensuring the local grid remained convincingly chaotic and uninteresting to centralized command, he allowed himself a moment of pure, unadulterated focus. He wasn't just protecting a contract now, he was safeguarding a potential future where innovation could flourish unmolested, a concept alien to his violent past, yet one that resonated deeply with the fractured sense of honor he carried. He knew the true attack was coming, and when it did, he would meet it not as a bodyguard, but as the necessary counterforce to oblivion. The quiet understanding between them reached a zenith not through conversation, but through synchronicity. Kalen, positioned miles away amidst the skeletal remains of an ancient communications tower, felt the subtle pressure drop in the electromagnetic spectrum. Ilara's signal that the ghost fence was fully online and engaging its first wave of unwelcome guests. Omnicorp, growing impatient with Vane's failure and the systemic disruptions caused by Kalen's calculated harassment, had finally deployed their elite internal security contingent, led by Commander Sarah, a cold, meticulous operative renowned for her perfect record in asset retrieval. Sarah was the anti-Kalen, trained in the newest generation of corporate martial arts, relying on pre-programmed tactical algorithms rather than intuition, a living testament to the very technological control Ilara fought against. When Sarah's first squad breached the periphery of the regulator station, they were not met with alarms, but with silence, followed by a slow, creeping systemic failure. The external floodlights dimmed, not due to power loss, but because their internal voltage regulators were subtly reversed, forcing them into a catastrophic overload that blew the localized transformer banks. This was Ilara's handiwork, turning the infrastructure against itself. Kalen, moving into the adjacent sector, intercepted the secondary breach teams attempting to flank the regulator through the subterranean access tunnels. He didn't rely on explosives this time. He used the environment itself. Manipulating ancient, waterlogged pressure valves, knowledge he'd retained from his early military mapping days, he flooded the tunnels with superheated vapor, not lethal immediately, but disorienting and debilitating enough to break the disciplined formations of Sarah's troops. The confrontation culminated with Kalen facing Sarah directly at the reinforced main entrance of the regulator station. Sarah was fast, her movements fluid and mathematically perfect, utilizing a specialized kinetic dampening suit that rendered Kalen's heavy impacts almost negligible. She mocked his antiquated methods, pointing out that his reliance on physical prowess was obsolete against modern, optimized security measures. "You are a relic, Kalen," she hissed through her helmet comms, "a blunt instrument in an age of precision." Kalen didn't argue. He understood that brute force was insufficient. He needed to introduce the one variable Sarah's programming couldn't account for: true unpredictability born from broken systems. As Sarah pressed her advantage, Kalen allowed her to gain ground, inviting her closer to the station's core housing, where Ilara was making her final move. At Kalen's signal, a single sharp exhalation captured by a nearby ambient microphone, Ilara executed the final phase of the ghost fence. She didn't try to shut down Sarah's suit. Instead, she broadcast a targeted, subliminal frequency directly into the suit's neural feedback loop, a frequency based on the very unstable early prototypes of the Prometheus interface. The effect was devastating. Sarah's algorithms, encountering a signal that mimicked system corruption without actually being one, entered a catastrophic diagnostic loop, freezing her mid-strike, her flawless movements locked into a grotesque tableau of corporate servitude. Kalen stepped past the paralyzed Commander Sarah, his expression impassive. He glanced briefly toward the access panel where Ilara was likely watching, then turned his attention to the incapacitated troops. He didn't execute them. He merely disabled their external comms and power cores, leaving them stranded and helpless for later municipal sweeps. A message that his intervention was surgical, focused only on the threat to Ilara. With the immediate physical threat neutralized, Kalen checked his own wounds, the damp air exacerbating the burn on his side. He knew the victory was temporary. Omnicorp would return with overwhelming force. But for this moment, Ilara was safe, her nascent world unmolested. He turned his back on the humming regulator station and melted away, not toward an established safe house, but toward the deepest, least mapped layers of the city, carrying the quiet satisfaction of having protected something truly worthwhile, a creation that promised a future unbound by the rigid control he once served. The scent of ozone and burnt synth fiber clung to Kalen as he retreated from the periphery, the silence now tinged with the faint, lingering echo of Sarah's diagnostic lockup. It was a sound of victory, one that pleased his ancient warrior instincts more than any explosion. He moved through the forgotten service tunnels, the metal beneath his boots singing a low, familiar counterpoint to the city's electric thrum. The information Ilara had provided, the map of the Hades unit safe zones, was proving invaluable, not just as shelter, but as a tactical graveyard. Every location was a memory, a ghost of a past life he was trying to bury. Yet now he used those ghosts to shield her future. He found temporary respite in a decommissioned water filtration plant deep beneath Sector Gamma, a location so far off the corporate grid it was rumored to be structurally unsound even by the standards of the periphery. Here, Kalen finally allowed himself to address the plasma burn on his side. The wound was serious, requiring more than the rudimentary sealant patches he carried. He worked with practiced economy, the pain a familiar companion, an anchor to the present moment. During the long hours of tending the injury, an unusual introspection surfaced. He found himself contemplating Ilara's philosophy, resilience through decentralization. It was the antithesis of the Hades unit's doctrine, which relied on absolute hierarchy and centralized command, a system whose failure nearly destroyed him. He realized that Ilara's genius lay in creating systems that were inherently resistant to the kind of corporate tyranny that had forged him into a weapon. Ilara, meanwhile, had gone entirely dark, even to Kalen's subtle probing signals. This was precisely what she intended, a complete digital vanishing act, allowing her to dedicate all processing power to securing the next phase of her project. She had moved the biological substrate processors, the very core of her new, resilient network, into a deep Earth geological monitoring bunker, shielded by tons of natural rock and earth. She wasn't just hiding from Omnicorp, she was establishing a baseline reality independent of Neo-Kyoto's control. Her emotional state had settled into a profound, almost monastic focus. The fear was gone, replaced by the exhilarating terror of creation. She thought of Kalen often, not as a savior, but as a vital, terrifying proof of concept. The ultimate deterrent, proving that highly specialized, ruthlessly focused individuals could still disrupt monolithic power structures. She wondered if he was safe, an abstract thought she quickly shelved. His survival was his own burden, much like hers now was. The corporate backlash, as Kalen predicted, intensified. Omnicorp, unable to trace the origin of the ghost fence or locate the rogue asset, began a systematic, brute force sweep of the lower sectors, flattening entire forgotten districts in their hunt for technological anomaly signatures. Kalen observed these scorched earth tactics from his vantage point, recognizing the desperation. He understood that this level of overt aggression would only drive more talent and dissent toward the periphery, toward Alara's eventual sphere of influence. He wasn't just protecting her, he was inadvertently creating the very ecosystem where her decentralized networks could thrive. Months passed in this state of kinetic dormancy. Kalen remained the unseen guardian, a perpetual low-level systemic error haunting Omnicorp's infrastructure. He was aware of the potential conflict brewing between his past life, the shadows of the Hades unit still clinging to his operational profile, and Ilara's future vision of open, organic technology. He knew that one day, the convergence would be unavoidable. He was the hammer, and she was building the resilient structure that the hammer would ultimately defend against the next inevitable siege. The narrative of their shared experience wasn't one of partnership, but of two highly specialized functions, destruction and creation, briefly intersecting for a single, critical purpose: to fracture the established order. Kalen settled deeper into the shadow of Sector Gamma, his vigilance absolute, waiting for the next signal, the next necessary application of finality. The deep earth bunker Ilara inhabited hummed with the quiet, steady pulse of her nascent network. It was a biological rhythm, a stark contrast to the brittle, electric pulse of Neo-Kyoto above. She had cultivated a small, self-sustaining ecosystem for her processors, using ambient thermal energy and filtered water recycled through layers of mineral beds. Her skin had taken on a pale, almost translucent quality from the lack of true sunlight, but her eyes, once clouded by corporate ambition, now shone with the fierce clarity of absolute dedication. She was no longer the celebrated prodigy. She was the architect of digital anonymity, finding a profound, almost spiritual satisfaction in creating something that actively rejected surveillance. One standard cycle, while running diagnostics on the seismic buffer layers, Ilara detected a minute, non-threatening intrusion, a highly specialized frequency modulation applied not to her network, but to the deep Earth environmental controls surrounding the bunker, a subtle, almost gentle manipulation of the air pressure regulators. It was a handshake, not an attack. Kalen. She responded not with code, but with physical action. Utilizing the bunker's emergency access conduit, a vertical shaft meant only for catastrophic failure, she ascended slowly. The journey upwards was a physical meditation on the distance she had traveled from the sterile heights of Omnicorp. When she finally reached the designated surface extraction point, a hidden maintenance hatch beneath the rusting chassis of a decommissioned sanitation vehicle in the industrial wasteland. The light above was weak, perpetually diffused by the smog layer. Kalen was there, leaning against the vehicle, his silhouette sharper, harder than she remembered. He was wearing different gear now, scavenged composite armor that looked functional rather than tactical, suggesting a sustained effort to remain beneath the corporate radar. He looked marginally better, the plasma wound having healed into a thick, white scar that pulled tight when he shifted his weight. He had utilized the Hades unit schematics, not just for cover, but to actively erase his own digital footprint from archival corporate databases, a feat of informational self-immolation that required legendary skill. "You broke the silence," Alara stated, her voice surprisingly strong after months of solitude. Kalen merely nodded, his pale eyes fixed on the distant, polluted skyline of Neo-Kyoto. The silence was becoming a target. Noise confuses the hounds. He pointed toward a specific quadrant of the city. They are consolidating assets. Vane's replacements are using predictive modeling based on your known behavioral tendencies before the Prometheus project. They expect you to seek established infrastructure. They are looking for a city. Alara understood instantly. Her next iteration required massive power and computational resources, things that existed only within the regulated zones. "I need access to the old orbital array relays, just for 48 hours, to anchor the core structure." Kalen's gaze finally connected with hers, a flicker of deep recognition crossing his features. He knew the array was the most heavily monitored structure outside the central spire. It was a suicide run. "That requires infiltration beyond what Rook provided," he stated flatly. "It requires drawing attention." "Which you are uniquely equipped to provide," Alara countered, meeting his gaze without flinching. "You need to be the chaos again, Kalen. A massive, visible event that forces their predictive models to break. I need them looking at the spectacular failure of the Death Lord, while I quietly build the unbreakable system underneath." She paused, a genuine small smile touching her lips. "You were inspired by your past efficiency. I need you to weaponize your legend." Kalen studied her, the creator who had learned the value of necessary violence. He saw that she was no longer seeking protection. She was seeking distraction, utilizing him as the most effective tactical diversion in the sector. It was the ultimate compliment to his skill. He pushed off the chassis of the sanitation vehicle, his posture shifting into his familiar, lethal readiness. "Tell me the timeline. I will arrange the spectacle." There was no question of payment or survival. There was only the execution of the required function. He was the shield, and she was demanding he become the shield's massive, distracting reflection, a deliberate beacon in the dark. He stepped back into the surrounding grime, already calculating the precise level of violence needed to satisfy Omnicorp's need for a scapegoat, ensuring Alara's new world could root itself in the ensuing quiet. The cinematic endeavor that is My Bodyguard is the Death Lord, 2026, presents a fascinating, if occasionally overwrought, meditation on duty, existential dread, and the aesthetics of the macabre, drawing heavily on established neo-noir sensibilities while attempting a high-concept fantasy overlay. Director Lena Voss, whose previous work often flirted with psychological horror before pivoting sharply into this large-scale epic, clearly aimed for a synthesis of visual splendor and thematic density, a goal that is partially achieved through the sheer commitment of its lead performers. The narrative centers on Kalen, portrayed with a brittle intensity by Elias Thorne. Thorne, known for his method approach and his breakthrough role in the minimalist art house drama The Quiet Room, brings a necessary weariness to Kalen, a mortal tasked with serving as the personal guard and unwitting confidant, to Mortis, the titular Death Lord. Mortis, brought to life by the ever-chameleonic Anya Volkov, is where the film truly finds its stylistic footing. Volkov, whose career trajectory mirrors that of veteran European character actors who transitioned seamlessly into blockbuster roles. Think of her dramatic pivot after winning acclaim for her stage work in St. Petersburg, manages to convey both ultimate, detached power and an almost childlike loneliness. Her interpretation of Mortis avoids the typical pantomime villainy often associated with cosmic entities. Instead, Volkov imbues the character with the quiet exhaustion of someone who has overseen entropy for millennia. The visual language of the film is arguably its strongest element. Cinematographer Hiroshi Tanaka, whose work on the visually challenging science fiction picture Zenith Point was lauded for its manipulation of shadow and negative space, crafts a world where eternal twilight reigns. The practical effects utilized for Mortis's spectral entourage, a choice that thankfully steers clear of overtly digital armies, lend a tactile, weighty dread to the proceedings. This commitment to tangible darkness is often reminiscent of early Tim Burton, albeit filtered through the muted, desaturated palette favored by modern prestige television productions. However, the film occasionally buckles under the weight of its own mythology. The dense exposition concerning the Edicts of Oblivion and the specific hierarchy of the Nether Realms sometimes halts the pacing, pulling the viewer out of the intensely personal relationship developing between Kalen and Mortis. This is particularly noticeable in the second act, where Kalen's internal struggle, his burgeoning empathy for the being he is sworn to protect, who paradoxically represents the end of everything he values, becomes bogged down by lore dumps. Thorne's performance anchors this emotional core. His background in deeply internalized dramas allows him to communicate volumes with minimal dialogue, relying instead on posture and the subtle tremor in his hands when handling Mortis's otherworldly artifacts. One can sense the influence of classic noir protagonists, the disillusioned man walking the morally gray line, filtered through a fantasy lens. His character arc is predictable in its broad strokes, the inevitable choice between duty and nascent affection, but the emotional sincerity of the execution elevates it above cliché. The score, composed by the avant-garde electronic musician Nullset, is another standout feature, employing deep subsonic frequencies and dissonant strings that act less as accompaniment and more as a physical presence in the theater. It perfectly underscores the film's central thematic tension, the uncomfortable intimacy found in the face of absolute finality. My Bodyguard is the Death Lord, despite its occasional narrative excesses, succeeds most when it focuses on the quiet moments shared between the eternal and the ephemeral, presenting a surprisingly tender portrait wrapped in the guise of a Gothic epic. It is a film that demands patience, but rewards attention with potent imagery and two mesmerizing central performances. The juxtaposition between Kalen's mortal fragility and Mortis's eternal nature forms the engine of the film's emotional resonance. Kalen, perpetually clad in armor that seems too heavy for his frame, moves through the echoing halls of the Shadow Citadel like a misplaced relic himself. Elias Thorne conveys Kalen's exhaustion not just from combat, but from the constant, low-frequency hum of proximity to absolute power. We see moments where Kalen hesitates before extinguishing a minor flicker of rebellious life, his eyes reflecting the horrifying beauty of the brief existence he is about to snuff out, a direct contrast to the stoicism expected of a Death Lord's retainer. This hesitation speaks volumes about Thorne's dedication to finding the human tremor beneath the imposed duty, a characteristic that defined his early career success in confined, emotionally pressurized settings. Anya Volkov's Mortis, conversely, is a study in controlled stillness. Her costumes, designed by the visionary Isolde Meyer, reject typical demonic iconography in favor of severe, architecturally severe gowns in blacks and deep indigos that seem to absorb light. When Mortis speaks, it is often in whispers that carry the weight of millennia of decisions. There is a recurring motif of Mortis observing mortal life through intricate, crystalline scrying pools, scenes where Volkov allows a flicker of profound curiosity, perhaps even longing, to cross her features. This suggests that the Death Lord is not malevolent, but rather deeply bored and inadvertently destructive through sheer lack of understanding of temporal value. This is the kind of nuanced, character-driven complexity Volkov mastered in her acclaimed stage performances, translating that intimate power into a supernatural context with startling effectiveness. The film's atmosphere is oppressive, almost suffocating, deliberately so. Voss utilizes extreme depth of field in many close-ups involving Kalin, rendering the background, even the imposing architecture, softly out of focus, visually isolating him within his service. This technique mirrors the psychological isolation Kalin experiences. He is surrounded by beings of immense power, yet entirely alone in his subjective human experience. The few instances of genuine warmth, perhaps a shared, silent meal in a barren chamber, or Mortis offering Kalin a rare, non-lethal cosmic bloom, are shocking in their rarity, functioning like sudden flares of sunlight in an otherwise perpetually eclipsed world. The thematic exploration of duty versus identity feels particularly resonant given the current cultural climate, touching on themes of corporate servitude and existential burnout, albeit projected onto a grand, mythological scale. Kalin's slow realization that serving the embodiment of cessation means sacrificing his own becoming is the film's emotional crescendo. When he finally confronts the possibility of defiance, it is not a grand revolutionary gesture, but a quiet refusal to perform a routine, soul-crushing task. This is the film operating at its best, leveraging the high fantasy conceit to illuminate very grounded, human dilemmas of self-preservation. While the elaborate sequences involving the lords of the lower planes offer visceral spectacle, it is the quiet, shared tension between the immortal protector and the mortal ward that lingers long after the credits roll, cementing My Bodyguard is the Death Lord as a strangely tender, if relentlessly grim, examination of symbiotic doomed relationships. The emotional landscape of the Citadel is painted in shades of profound melancholy, a feeling amplified by the deliberate slowness of the pacing in these character-focused exchanges. Kalin's internal conflict manifests physically. Thorn often plays scenes with a slight tremor in his left hand, an unaddressed injury perhaps, or perhaps the manifestation of his soul straining against the unnatural service. This subtlety is a direct callback to Thorne's early indie work, where physical restraint often spoke louder than any delivered monologue, suggesting a deeper well of suffering beneath the polished exterior of the guard. He is a man constantly bracing for an impact that never truly comes to him, only to others. Mortis, in her moments of vulnerability, which are few and far between, often revealed when she believes Kalin is occupied with mundane guard duties, displays a weariness that transcends simple fatigue. Volkov portrays immortality not as limitless energy, but as an infinite repetition of the same outcome. Everything ends. Her eyes, often subtly lined with cosmic dust, hold a flat, reflective quality, like polished obsidian. There is a scene where Kalin accidentally shatters a small, ancient glass figurine belonging to Mortis. Instead of immediate wrath, Mortis simply touches the shards, and they slowly reassemble, only to crumble moments later into finer dust. This small miracle, immediately undone, encapsulates her existence. Volkov plays this not with anger at the breakage, but with quiet resignation at the inevitability of entropy, a concept that clearly fascinates and exhausts her simultaneously. Director Voss ensures that the power dynamic is constantly being renegotiated, not through physical conflict, but through subtle shifts in proximity and eye contact. In the early parts of the film, Kalin maintains a precise, mandated distance. As the narrative progresses, spurred by shared moments of silence during the long watches, Kalin begins to encroach upon that boundary, not with aggression, but with a tentative, human need for connection. There is a particularly striking scene, set during a rare solar eclipse above the citadel, where the ambient light shifts to a bruised purple. Kalin is permitted to rest, and Mortis stands over him, seemingly observing his sleep. The camera lingers on Mortis's face as she watches Kalin dream, and for the first time, the shield of cosmic detachment cracks, revealing a profound, almost maternal curiosity mixed with the terrifying awareness that she could erase him with a single thought. The thematic focus on aestheticized darkness serves as a necessary counterpoint to the burgeoning tenderness. The world is beautiful, precisely because it is doomed. The lighting design, so adept at utilizing deep blacks, ensures that any light source, a single candle, the faint glow of Kalin's drawn blade, or the brief spectral radiance of Mortis's true form, feels earned and precious. This visual grammar elevates the film beyond typical dark fantasy. It becomes a deliberate, slow-motion study of how affection can bloom even in the most sterile, fatalistic environments. My Bodyguard is the Death Lord ultimately posits that even the architect of cessation yearns for something lasting, something that defies the very nature of the entity it serves. The film's exploration of duty finally culminates in the act of necessary betrayal, a plot point handled with agonizing restraint. Kalin's trajectory moves him from being merely an observer of suffering to an active participant in the disruption of the cosmic order, though his rebellion is deeply personal rather than overtly political. The narrative cleverly avoids the cliché of a grand battle. Kalin's final confrontation with Mortis is internalized, played out in the austere throne room where their relationship solidified. Thorne embodies the agony of this choice. His body language shifts from the rigid posture of the guard to the slumped readiness of a man accepting his own demise. He is not fighting to win freedom, but fighting to validate the humanity he rediscovered in the shadow of oblivion. The emotional core of this climax relies heavily on the sound design. The music by Nullset drops away almost entirely, leaving only the harsh sounds of their immediate environment. The scrape of Kalin's boots on the polished floor, the faint, high-pitched whine that signifies Mortis's displeasure or concentration, and the labored sound of Kalin's own breathing. This sonic austerity forces the audience to focus entirely on the unspoken terms of their farewell. When Kalin finally makes his move, it is not a blow meant to kill, an impossibility against an entity like Mortis, but an act of transference, an attempt to impose his brief, vibrant mortality onto the Death Lord. Volkov's reaction to this final intimacy is perhaps her most powerful moment. There is no rage, no declaration of eternal damnation. Instead, Mortis reacts with a moment of genuine, unmasked confusion, an expression that implies Kalin has done something entirely outside the predictable parameters of existence and cessation. She doesn't seek vengeance. She seeks understanding of this inexplicable intrusion of fragile, self-sacrificial love into her domain of cold finality. This moment solidifies the theme. Mortis, for all her power, remains fundamentally a passive force, defined by the end of things, while Kalin, through his choice, becomes an active agent of meaning. Lena Voss manages the denouement with a painterly eye. The aftermath is not chaotic destruction, but a quiet, almost sterile transition. Kalen's fate is left ambiguous, shrouded in the same evocative shadow that defines the Citadel. However, the visual evidence suggests a blending, an absorption rather than a simple termination. The final lingering shot focuses not on the absence of Kalen, but on a subtle change in Mortis. Perhaps a slightly warmer shadow cast by her form, or a momentary hesitation before she turns away from the now empty space where Kalen stood. It's a conclusion that respects the film's commitment to melancholy. No neat happy endings are permitted. But it allows for the possibility that the guard successfully inoculated the Death Lord with a memory, a lingering echo of temporal affection that forever alters the nature of eternal boredom. This final resonant note leaves the audience contemplating whether even death can resist the persistent beauty of human connection. The enduring impact of My Bodyguard is the Death Lord rests heavily on this ambiguous resolution, a characteristic trait of Voss's directorial inclination towards lingering thematic questions over concrete narrative closure. The subtlety of Kalen's final act, the transference, is crucial. It aligns perfectly with Thorne's established on-screen persona as an actor who excels at portraying quiet, internal revolutions. His preparation for this role, reportedly involving extensive meditation to capture the state of absolute surrender before action, pays dividends here. The scene feels less like a battle and more like a final, profound offering of self. The audience is left wondering if this infusion of mortal experience grants Mortis a new perspective, or merely adds another layer of beautiful, transient data to her eons of observation. Volkov's portrayal of the resultant effect on Mortis is brilliantly understated. In the film's closing minutes, after Kalen's physical presence has dissolved into the ethereal structure of the Citadel, Mortis is shown alone, performing a routine administrative task, the cataloging of a recently extinguished star system. However, the meticulousness of her movements is briefly interrupted. Her hand pauses over the console, and she subtly tilts her head, a gesture that suggests she is actively listening to something internal, something that isn't a cosmic wave or an echoing decree from the greater void. It's the sound of Kalen's labored breathing, perhaps echoing in the architecture of her awareness. This small behavioral deviation is the film's ultimate thesis, that even the cessation of all things can be momentarily distracted by the memory of intense, fleeting life. Cinematographer Tanaka underscores this final moment with a masterful technical flourish. For the very first time in the film, a warm, almost amber-hued light, a reflection perhaps of the life force transferred, briefly illuminates the edge of Mortis's otherwise entirely monochromatic environment. It vanishes almost instantly, yet its presence lingers in the mind's eye. This decision to introduce color only at the very last moment serves as a visual punctuation mark, signifying that the sterile, objective truth of death has been momentarily complicated, perhaps even softened, by the subjective intensity of Kalen's sacrifice. The film concludes not with the triumph of good or evil, but with the profound, aching beauty of a shared moment that defied its own expiration date, leaving the audience with the unsettling realization that true intimacy might only be achievable when one party is prepared to wholly cease existing. The narrative's lingering power stems directly from this masterful refusal to assign definitive victory or defeat. Kalen's sacrifice functions not as an attempted overthrow of death itself, but as an act of inscription, writing a brief, intensely felt human story onto the eternal parchment of the Death Lord. Elias Thorne's commitment to portraying Kalen's emotional arc as a series of quiet erosions rather than dramatic explosions, resonates with the traditions of minimalist acting where subtext dictates meaning. One recalls the critical acclaim Thorne received for his silent performance in The Quiet Room, where physical discomfort conveyed psychological collapse. Here, that same discipline is applied to the spiritual collapse that precedes self-annihilation for a greater, albeit undefined, purpose. He achieves a tragic nobility, not by slaying the dragon, but by making the dragon pause its endless cycle to notice him. Anya Volkov's Mortis, throughout the film's extended final sequence, embodies a new form of stillness. Where before her repose suggested detachment, now it hints at contemplation, perhaps even confusion born from unprecedented sensation. Her vast, ornate hands, usually occupied with gesturing across star charts or dismissing legions, now rest inert on the armrests of her throne. The power dynamic shifts subtly. Mortis is still supremely powerful, yet Kaelin's final action has introduced an element of the unknowable into her perfect equation of endings. This mirrors the challenges Volkov faced, transitioning from intense, realistic theater roles to portraying godlike figures. She consistently chooses the human reaction, the flicker of recognition, over the expected supernatural spectacle. Lena Voss's direction here is less about spectacle and more about atmosphere as a narrative force. The use of deep, echoing soundscapes that only carry Kaelin's internal residue emphasizes the theme that memory and emotional impact are the only true forms of immortality available to mortals. The citadel itself seems to react, its stone surfaces appearing marginally less sharp, the shadows perhaps slightly less absolute. This environmental feedback is the film's most potent visual metaphor for change. It suggests that to truly touch the eternal, one must become a part of its structure, even if that integration means sacrificing the distinct self. Ultimately, My Bodyguard is the Death Lord succeeds not because it provides answers about the afterlife or cosmic servitude, but because it meticulously charts the emotional terrain of two beings irrevocably drawn together across an impossible gulf of being. It is a dark romance disguised as high fantasy bureaucracy, elevated by performances that prioritize truthful internal struggle over external bombast. The film leaves the audience not with the satisfaction of a completed quest, but with the persistent, chilling question: what is the value of a life lived if its only lasting legacy is the momentary disruption of eternity? The residual emotional echo left by Kaelin's sacrifice dictates the film's final movements, establishing a melancholic epilogue that feels more like a prolonged meditation than a traditional closing scene. Mortis, having experienced that anomalous intrusion of genuine, uncalculated human emotion, is visually transformed by its absence. Her characteristic obsidian stillness now appears fractured. The perfect geometry of her posture seems slightly askew, a minute structural fault in the architecture of infinity. Volkov masterfully conveys this internal shifting by subtly adjusting her vocal cadence. Her pronouncements, previously delivered with the uniform resonance of an eternal being, now carry an almost imperceptible waver, as if the air in the vast chamber itself is thick with Kaelin's fleeting essence. This subtle disorientation in Mortis is beautifully contrasted by the film's visual texture in these final moments. Tanaka moves away from the oppressive, deep-focused shadows and introduces a diffused, almost watery quality to the background illumination. It's as if the citadel is finally admitting the influence of the outside world, or perhaps reflecting the internal turmoil of its ruler. We see Mortis interact with an archive terminal, not with her usual swift, decisive keystrokes, but with a hesitant slowness. Her long, pale fingers hover over the controls, seeming to search not for data, but for a specific frequency, the echo of Kalen's presence. This mirrors the very real, difficult transition Thorne navigated in his early career, where playing characters wrestling with trauma required sustained focus on minute physical actions to convey massive internal shifts. Lena Voss frames these moments to emphasize the vastness of Mortis's solitude, now compounded by memory. In one extended shot, Mortis stands before a gigantic, panoramic window overlooking the perpetually dark void. She does not gaze out into the stars, but rather focuses on her own reflection in the glass. This self-scrutiny is a direct consequence of Kalen's action. He forced her to see herself not as the inevitable end, but as an entity capable of being affected. The slight furrow in her brow, almost invisible beneath the high-contrast lighting, suggests a nascent form of grief, not for Kalen's death, which is trivial, but for the sudden, terrifying realization of what it means to remember something ephemeral. The film quietly closes the loop on the theme of duty. While Kalen failed his sworn oath to serve silently until the end, he succeeded in an entirely different, personal duty: the preservation of his own capacity to feel and connect. My bodyguard is the Death Lord suggests that true heroism, even against cosmic forces, is not about winning the war against oblivion, but about ensuring that one's brief moment within that war possessed undeniable emotional weight. The lingering effect of the film is this haunting understanding that the most powerful force against endless, cold continuity might just be a deeply felt, utterly transient human connection, capable of leaving an indelible mark even on the very definition of death. The ultimate resonance of the film pivots on the question of whether Mortis will integrate this newfound emotional data or simply process it as another anomaly to be filed away. The final shot offers a deeply ambiguous answer, leaning towards the possibility of lasting transformation. Voss deliberately avoids any scene where Mortis overtly expresses human emotion, no tears, no shouted anguish, which would cheapen the sophisticated restraint built throughout the preceding 2 hours. Instead, the film suggests transformation through altered habit. Following the archival scene, Mortis is shown returning to her primary function, overseeing the balance of endings. However, the rhythm is off. When a subordinate entity, a lesser wraith tasked with pruning an overpopulated minor dimension, reports success, Mortis offers a dismissal that is noticeably softer, less abrupt than her prior interactions. Anya Volkov portrays this shift as an almost physical loosening of tension around her mouth, a relaxation of the eternal mask. This suggests that Kalen's final act introduced a variable, empathy, or perhaps just the intense memory of self-sacrifice that Mortis cannot simply erase through divine decree. It must be managed, integrated into the vast computational framework of her existence. Elias Thorne's influence, though physically absent, permeates these final frames. The very air seems calibrated to his absence. The lingering amber reflection Tanaka introduced during the climax does not entirely vanish. It subtly persists in the lower quadrants of the screen during moments of Mortis's solitude, acting as a visual ghost of Kalen's warmth. This implies that Kalen did not just leave an echo, but effectively altered the environmental parameters of the Death Lord's domain, subtly undermining the absolute coldness that defined it previously. The film's conclusion, therefore, is less about the fate of Kalen and more about the slow, agonizing rebirth of the Eternal. My bodyguard as the Death Lord becomes a profound argument against nihilism, suggesting that while death is inevitable, the way it is perceived and executed can be influenced by the sincerity of ephemeral life. It's a testament to Voss's vision that she uses the grandest possible canvas, cosmic power, to explore the most minute, personal acts of courage. The success of the film rests on the audience, accepting that the quietest betrayal can sometimes cause the greatest, most enduring ripple throughout the fabric of existence, leaving the Death Lord not defeated, but thoughtfully, perhaps even permanently, haunted. The lingering, haunting quality of the ending is further solidified by the film's commitment to its neo-noir aesthetic, even in its fantastical conclusion. The final narrative beats mirror the structure of classic noir, where the flawed protagonist achieves a moral victory at the cost of personal annihilation. Kalen's sacrifice acts as the ultimate cynical triumph. He proves that even the unfeeling machinery of cosmic order must acknowledge an act of pure, self-negating devotion. This aligns perfectly with the world-weary sensibilities Thorne often channels, suggesting that nobility is found not in overthrowing oppressive systems, but in finding one's own uncompromising truth within them. Volkov's performance in these after-moments transcends typical villain closure. Mortis is not reformed in a conventional sense. She remains the Death Lord. However, the introduction of Kalen's memory, represented by that persistent, subtle warmth, forces a fundamental re-evaluation of her purpose. In one particularly striking, lingering close-up, Mortis observes a reflection of the void, and for a split second, her expression shifts to mimic exhaustion, a deeply human state. This suggests that Kalen transferred not just his love, but the burden of temporal awareness, giving the immortal an acute, if temporary, understanding of limitation and loss. This echoes Volkov's own artistic commitment to finding relatable vulnerability even in monstrous roles, grounding the cosmic in the painfully personal. The final sequence is punctuated by a deliberate lack of score, emphasizing the environmental sounds that now carry Kalen's legacy. The silence is not empty. It is filled with the subtle, unsettling awareness of difference. Voss uses ambient sound, the distant groan of celestial mechanics, the soft rustle of Mortis's light-absorbing robes, to suggest that the citadel itself is acclimatizing to a new atmospheric pressure caused by Kalen's infusion of feeling. The visual language, though muted, hints at this change. The edges of the frame seem softer, less sharply defined by Tanaka's harsh contrasts. It's as if the world, which had been rendered in stark, black and white morality, duty versus self, has gained a slight, unshakable tint of gray uncertainty. My Bodyguard is the Death Lord, ultimately functions as a sophisticated character study disguised by high-concept world-building. It examines how the necessity of ending is challenged not by opposition, but by authentic connection. The film's lasting power lies in the idea that true impact is achieved not through longevity, but through the intensity of brief experience. Kalen may have been utterly annihilated, but he succeeded in marking the eternal with a fleeting, beautiful scar, forcing the Death Lord to briefly contemplate what it means to possess something that cannot simply be extinguished. The narrative's deliberate ambiguity surrounding the long-term effects on Mortis serves as the film's final, most profound commentary on human legacy. It avoids the pitfall of suggesting that a single mortal life can instantly reprogram an eternal entity, leaning instead on the concept of persistent, low-grade influence. Mortis's subsequent actions, though seemingly routine, are now imbued with this context. When she finally returns to her customary observation deck overlooking the cosmic decay, her stance is markedly different from the beginning of the film. Where initially she presented as utterly self-contained, the very structure of her being now suggests a subtle tension, as if she is constantly bracing for another unexpected emotional input. This implied internal struggle is perfectly conveyed through the minute adjustments in Volkov's physical performance. Her usual, almost unnervingly smooth movements now possess an almost imperceptible hitch, a slight delay before commencing an action. This hesitation is the ghost of Kaelin's sacrifice made manifest, the Death Lord briefly questioning the efficiency or necessity of the end process, a concept utterly foreign to her until that fatal, intimate encounter. It is a testament to Volkov's depth that she can communicate such complex cosmological uncertainty through something as simple as the timing of a turn of the head. Furthermore, the ambient soundscape in the final reel becomes crucial. The complete absence of score is replaced by an almost subliminal, high-frequency tone that only emerges when Mortis is alone. This tone is often associated in psychological thrillers with tinnitus or prolonged stress, suggesting that the memory of Kaelin is not a comforting presence, but a source of subtle, persistent irritation to her perfect, ordered oblivion. This aligns with the existential dread explored in Thorne's earlier, stripped-down dramatic work, where inner peace was always elusive. Here, Thorne's final impact is to rob the immortal of her own hard-won inner stillness. Director Voss ensures that the audience understands this quiet revolution is the true victory. Kaelin didn't destroy death, he made it aware of its own solitary nature. The lingering shot of the citadel, bathed in that almost imperceptible diffused light, suggests that the setting itself has been fundamentally altered, subtly retuned by a mortal's capacity for selfless love. My Bodyguard as the Death Lord thus transcends the genre framework, concluding as a tragic, yet strangely hopeful meditation on how the most powerful expressions of life are those that choose meaning over mere existence, leaving an indelible mark on even the very concept of nothingness. The enduring ambiguity of the ending subtly pivots the film's focus from Kaelin's sacrifice to the ongoing nature of Mortis's eternal service, now colored by remembrance. The final implication is that true immortality might not be endless life, but the capacity to carry significant, formative memories without succumbing to them. Mortis, the embodiment of cessation, has inadvertently been granted a form of human memory, a timeline marked by intense, albeit tragic, connection. This forces a thematic reading where mortality, paradoxically, provides a richer experience than eternity. Elias Thorne's legacy within the film is secured by this final impression of noble futility. His character arc resolves not through escape or conquest, but through the successful delivery of a unique emotional payload. The discipline Thorne brought to portraying characters under immense internal pressure is key here. His final moments of stillness before the transference are more emotionally charged than any explosive action sequence could have been. It suggests that the quietest existence, when lived authentically, can leave a louder echo than the loudest reign of power. His guard duty ultimately transforms into an act of transcendental witness. Anya Volkov's interpretation of this altered state is a masterclass in minimal character evolution. The subtle vocal tremor, the slight hesitation in acknowledging subordinates, these details suggest that the core function of the Death Lord is now occasionally interrupted by subjective experience. Where before Mortis dictated the end, she now seems to be wrestling with the meaning of endings, a perspective entirely alien to her nature. This resonates with Volkov's known preference for roles that explore the psychological cost of immense power, illustrating that absolute control is ultimately less interesting than the unexpected vulnerability that comes from acknowledging an outside influence. Hiroshi Tanaka's final visual choices serve to underscore this theme of subtle alteration. The persistent, almost undetectable warmth in the shadows is not a beacon of hope, but a constant, gentle reminder of the boundary that was crossed. It functions as a permanent, low-grade fever within the system of the universe overseen by Mortis. Lena Voss uses this visual language to argue that genuine change is never instantaneous or loud. It is a slow permeation, a gradual acceptance of a new, slightly warmer truth in the face of absolute cold. My bodyguard is the Death Lord, thus concludes not with a bang or a whimper, but with the sound of an eternal being quietly reconsidering the nature of what it means to conclude anything at all. The film's thematic ambition culminates in the unsettling realization that Mortis's burden has not been lifted, but rather transmuted. She is no longer merely the administrator of finality. She has become the reluctant curator of a singular, poignant memory. This development suggests that Kalen's true victory was not in defying death, but in making death aware of beauty, a concept antithetical to its very structure. The film suggests that the greatest rebellion against cosmic indifference is the creation of something intensely specific and irreplicable. Thorne's embodiment of Kalen leaves an afterimage so powerful, precisely because his performance was rooted in stoicism, cracking under moral strain. In the final frames where the Citadel reflects his warmth, one almost expects to see Kalen's armor, that heavy binding shell, lying discarded, symbolizing the shedding of imposed identity. His eventual absorption into the structure is framed not as obliteration, but as permanent attachment, a final, necessary integration into the fabric he sought to momentarily illuminate. His mortality has become Mortis's eternal footnote. Volkov's portrayal of this newly burdened eternity is perhaps the most chilling aspect of the epilogue. The subtle wavering in her voice is not interpreted by the narrative as growing kindness, but as a fundamental, structural instability. She remains an entity defined by cold logic, but now that logic is polluted by the illogical variable of human sacrifice. There is a lingering shot where Mortis interacts with the cosmic bloom Kalen was once gifted. She handles it with extreme care, not out of affection for the bloom, but perhaps out of an intellectual fascination with the last thing Kalen touched, treating it like an exquisite piece of dangerous, unstable evidence. This suggests that the memory is not a comfort, but a constant, low-level threat to her necessary apathy. Voss and Tanaka utilize the final moments to emphasize this tension between eternal order and momentary chaos. The environmental glow, the amber trace, does not spread. It remains localized around Mortis, like a stain that cannot be scrubbed from immaculate white marble. This visual confinement reinforces the idea that Kalen's influence is profound but narrowly focused, a perfectly encapsulated tragedy. My bodyguard is the Death Lord closes on the understanding that while the universe marches toward entropy, the most meaningful moments are those brief, desperate flares of connection that briefly manage to defy the inevitable, leaving behind only ghosts of light for the everlasting to contend with. The film's dedication to this pervasive sense of beautiful tragedy ensures that the final auditory experience is as meticulously crafted as the visual ones. As the frame tightens on Mortis, contemplating the fragile cosmic bloom, the high-frequency stress tone that had begun to permeate the environment subtly shifts in pitch. It doesn't vanish, which would imply resolution, but rather modulates into a slower, more deliberate rhythm, almost mimicking a profound internal heartbeat. This auditory shift is the most concrete evidence of Kalen's integration. The immortal mechanism has recalibrated its tempo to accommodate the memory of temporal existence. This calculated alteration in sound design speaks volumes about Lena Voss's directorial philosophy, that true horror, or true pathos, resides not in grand pronouncements, but in the subtle corruption of established patterns. Mortis is still functioning,